This is a barrel of crude oil, 42 gallons of hydrocarbon energy, currently trading at $127 on the international market. Seems like a commodity, fungible, interchangeable, flowing wherever the price is right. Except oil doesn't flow wherever it wants. It flows through pipelines. And whoever controls the pipelines controls who gets energy and who doesn't. 3 days ago, Turkey completed construction on a project that Western intelligence agencies didn't know existed until satellite imagery revealed it last month. A 2,847-kilometer pipeline running from the Caspian Sea through Azerbaijan, across Turkey, and terminating at a new deepwater port in the Mediterranean, entirely bypassing every route that flows through European-controlled territory. The project cost? $127 billion over 6 years. The strategic value? $500 billion in annual energy trade that Europe can no longer sanction, tax, or influence. President Erdogan calls it the sovereignty corridor. The name isn't propaganda, it's description. Turkey just became the choke point for energy flowing from Central Asia, the Caucasus, and the Middle East to every market on Earth. And Europe, which spent a decade trying to reduce energy dependence on Russia, just discovered they've traded one dependency for another. Except this time, they have no leverage at all. Here's what they're not telling you. The pipeline wasn't secret because Turkey was hiding it. It was secret because no one was looking. Western intelligence services were focused on Russia, China, Iran, the obvious threats. Turkey was a NATO ally. Turkey was a candidate for EU membership. Turkey was, in the Western imagination, fundamentally aligned with Western interests. That imagination died somewhere between the 2016 coup attempt and the 2024 realignment, when Erdogan formally withdrew Turkey's EU membership application and announced a multi-vector foreign policy that treated East and West as equally valid partners. The pipeline construction began in 2020, during COVID, when satellite monitoring was reduced and international inspections were suspended. By 2022, the main trunk was complete. By 2024, the Mediterranean terminal at Antalya was operational. By last week, the first commercial shipments began flowing. At 4:30 a.m. Eastern on January 23rd, tanker tracking data showed the first cargo, 2.1 million barrels of Kazakh crude, loaded at Antalya, bound for Mumbai. The transaction settled in Turkish lira and Indian rupees. No dollars touched the trade. No European port was involved. No Western financial institution processed the payment. The second cargo, 12 hours later, Azerbaijani condensate bound for China. The third, Turkmen gas liquids bound for Pakistan. Each transaction outside the dollar system, each transaction bypassing the European energy network that Brussels spent decades building. At 9:15 a.m. Eastern on January 24th, I obtained a copy of the operational manifest for the Antalya terminal through a source in Turkish maritime logistics. The manifest shows capacity utilization for the next 90 days, 94%. 94% capacity. For a terminal that didn't officially exist until last month. The customers were lined up before the pipeline was announced. This is where the lie becomes unsustainable. Europe's energy strategy since 2022 has been built on one assumption, that alternative supplies, from the United States, from the Middle East, from North Africa, would flow through European-controlled infrastructure. LNG terminals in Germany, Netherlands, and Poland. Pipeline connections from Azerbaijan through Georgia to European networks. Tanker routes through the Suez Canal to Mediterranean refineries. All of these routes gave Europe leverage, pricing power, sanctioning capability, the ability to say no to Russia, to Iran, to anyone who didn't play by European rules. The sovereignty corridor removes that leverage entirely. Caspian oil that would have flowed through Georgia to European markets now flows through Turkey to Asian markets. Middle Eastern crude that would have transited the Suez to Rotterdam now loads at Antalya for Mumbai. Europe isn't being cut off. Europe is being bypassed. The distinction matters. Being cut off creates crisis and sympathy. Being bypassed creates irrelevance and indifference. At 11 a.m. Brussels time on January 24th, the European Commission held an emergency energy security meeting. The meeting was scheduled for 3 hours. It lasted 7. No statement was released afterward. A source inside the Commission described the mood as controlled panic. The officials realized, apparently for the first time, that Turkey's NATO membership had created a blind spot, an assumption of alignment that prevented serious analysis of Turkish strategic capabilities. The capabilities are now undeniable. The pipeline exists. It's operational. It's at 94% capacity. And Europe has no way to interdict, sanction, or influence the flows. The mechanism of European energy dependence is now laid bare. Europe consumes approximately 14 million barrels of oil equivalent daily. Domestic production covers roughly 3 million barrels. The remaining 11 million must be imported. Before the Ukraine war, Russia supplied approximately 4 million barrels daily. European sanctions and Russian countermeasures reduced that flow to approximately 800,000 barrels, mostly through grandfathered contracts and third-country intermediaries. The replacement supply came from multiple sources: increased U.S. LNG exports, redirected Middle Eastern crude, expanded Norwegian production, and Caspian flows through the Southern Gas Corridor. The Sovereignty Corridor competes directly for the Caspian and Middle Eastern volumes. Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, and Turkmenistan now have a choice: sell through European-connected routes at European prices, or sell through Turkey at market prices to Asian buyers paying premiums. The choice isn't difficult. Asian markets are paying $8 to $12 per barrel above European benchmark prices. The premium reflects faster economic growth, less regulatory burden, and the simple fact that Asian demand exceeds supply, while European demand is constrained by climate policy and economic stagnation. At 2:30 p.m. Eastern on January 24th, Kazakhstan's state oil company announced it would redirect a significant portion of export volumes to the Antalya route beginning February 1st. The announcement didn't specify quantities, but Kazakhstan exports approximately 1.6 million barrels daily. Significant portion likely means 40 to 60%. That's 640,000 to 960,000 barrels daily that Europe was counting on and won't receive. Not because of sanctions or conflict, because of economics and geography. Turkey positioned itself perfectly for this moment. Erdogan's foreign policy, criticized in Western capitals as erratic, unreliable, transactional, was actually strategic positioning for exactly this outcome. Turkey maintained relations with Russia while remaining in NATO. It maintained relations with Iran while hosting American air bases. It maintained relations with China while negotiating EU accession. Every door stayed open. Every option remained available. The pipeline required cooperation from Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, and Turkmenistan, all of which have complicated relationships with Russia. Turkey's balanced posture made it the only partner all three could trust simultaneously. It required Chinese financing, approximately $40 billion in construction loans from Chinese state banks. Turkey's participation in Belt and Road initiatives, despite Western objections, secured that capital. It required technical expertise that Turkey didn't have domestically. Turkish companies partnered with Chinese and Russian engineering firms, transferring knowledge that Turkey now owns outright. The project's success is Erdogan's vindication. Every Western criticism of his multi-vector approach assumed that Turkey needed Western approval to thrive. The pipeline proves Turkey can thrive, perhaps thrive better, without Western approval. At 5 p.m. Ankara time on January 24th, Erdogan addressed the Turkish parliament. His speech was carried live across the Middle East, Central Asia, and North Africa. For 70 years, Turkey was a bridge between East and West. A bridge is walked upon. A bridge serves others' purposes. Turkey is no longer a bridge. Turkey is a destination. Turkey is a hub. Turkey decides who crosses, at what price, under what terms. The speech received standing ovations in Ankara. It received alarm in Brussels and Washington, and it received careful study in Beijing, Moscow, and New Delhi, capitals that recognized Turkey had executed exactly the strategic repositioning they themselves had attempted. The $500 billion annual trade flow estimate comes from Turkish government projections, which may be optimistic. But even conservative analysis supports $300 to $400 billion annually within 5 years. The Sovereignty Corridor can handle 4 million barrels of oil equivalent daily at full capacity. At $127 per barrel, that's $508 million daily in crude value alone. Add refined products, petrochemicals, and natural gas liquids, and daily value exceeds $700 million. $700 million daily is $255 billion annually. But the pipeline isn't just a conduit, it's a platform. Refineries are under construction along the route. Petrochemical plants are being planned. Storage facilities already hold 80 million barrels. Turkey isn't just moving energy. Turkey is adding value to energy, refining, processing, storing, financing. Each step captures margin that previously accrued to European or Asian processors. The $500 billion estimate includes the entire energy ecosystem building around the Sovereignty Corridor. The crude flows, the refined products, the petrochemicals, the shipping services, the financial services, the insurance, the storage, the trading. Turkey has created an energy city-state in the Mediterranean, like Singapore for Asian shipping, like Rotterdam for European trade. Except Turkey answers to no one. Less than 90 days separate today from the point where European energy markets begin feeling measurable impact. The first contracts redirecting from European routes to Antalya execute in February. The volume builds through March. By April, European refineries will be competing for supply they previously considered secured. The price impact is already emerging. Brent crude for European delivery is trading at $4.50 premium to Brent for Asian delivery, a reversal of the historical pattern where Asia paid premiums. The market is pricing in European supply constraints before the constraints fully materialize. At 8:30 a.m. Eastern this morning, BP's chief executive gave an interview to the Financial Times acknowledging the shift. Turkey has changed the geometry of global energy flows. We're adjusting our supply assumptions accordingly. European refiners will need to compete on price in ways they haven't for decades. Compete on price. That's corporate language for pay more or get less. European consumers will see the impact in gasoline prices, heating costs, and electricity bills. The EU's climate agenda, which assumes energy prices high enough to encourage transition, but not so high as to cause economic damage, collides with a new reality where energy prices are set by Asian demand, not European policy. When choke points shift, power shifts with them. The Suez Canal gave Egypt leverage. The Strait of Hormuz gave Iran leverage. The Bosphorus gave Turkey leverage over Black Sea trade. The Sovereignty Corridor gives Turkey leverage over energy that doesn't even transit Turkish waterways, energy that previously flowed through routes Turkey had no influence over. That leverage is already being exercised. On January 25th, Turkey announced a new transit fee structure for energy flowing through the Sovereignty Corridor. The fees are modest, 75 cents per barrel equivalent, but they establish the principle that Turkey taxes energy flows. 75 cents per barrel times 4 million barrels daily times 365 days equals $1.1 billion annually in transit fees alone, and the rate can be adjusted. The precedent is what matters. Turkey also announced preferential routing for nations that maintain strategic alignment with Turkish interests. The phrase is vague intentionally. It means Turkey will prioritize flows to friends and delay flows to others. The mechanism for influence is established. The exercise of that influence will follow. What the informed understand is that the Sovereignty Corridor is the physical manifestation of a geopolitical shift that's been underway for a decade. The post-Cold War assumption that former periphery nations would integrate into Western-led systems, accepting Western rules in exchange for Western markets, has collapsed. Turkey, India, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, each is building independent capabilities that reduce dependence on Western systems. The Sovereignty Corridor is infrastructure, but it's infrastructure that embodies a philosophy, that nations can chart independent paths, can play multiple powers against each other, can extract value from their geographic position, rather than accepting the role assigned by historical alignments. Turkey's success will be studied and replicated. Indonesia controlling the Strait of Malacca, Egypt leveraging the Suez, Panama leveraging the canal. Every nation with geographic advantages will reconsider whether those advantages are being fully exploited. The era of Western-dominated trade infrastructure is ending. What replaces it is a world of competing corridors, each controlled by regional powers, each extracting tolls, each exercising influence. For Europe, the implications are severe. Energy security assumed diversified supply through Western-accessible routes. That assumption is invalid. Climate policy assumed manageable energy prices during transition. Prices will be set by Asian competition, not European policy. Foreign policy assumed Turkey as a difficult but ultimately aligned partner. Turkey is now an independent power with interests that may or may not align with Europe's. Each assumption was foundational. Each assumption has failed. The barrel of oil weighs about 300 pounds. It contains energy equivalent to 25,000 hours of human labor. Civilizations are built on oil, or they're constrained by its absence. Europe built a civilization on the assumption that oil would flow through channels Europe influenced. That assumption held for 80 years. It ended 3 days ago, when the first cargo loaded at Antalya and Europe wasn't consulted. $127 per barrel today. Perhaps $140 by spring, as European buyers compete with Asian buyers for supply flowing through Turkish terminals. Perhaps $160 by summer, as the full redirection of Caspian and Middle Eastern volumes becomes apparent. The price isn't set in Brussels or Washington anymore. It's set in Ankara, in Beijing, in Mumbai, capitals that view European energy needs as opportunities to extract value, not obligations to support. The sovereignty corridor is 2,847 kilometers of pipe, steel, and concrete. But it's also the answer to a question Europe didn't know was being asked. What happens when geography is monetized by someone who doesn't share your interests? The answer is arriving now, barrel by barrel, tanker by tanker, through a pipeline that didn't exist until it suddenly did. Erdogan built it while Europe wasn't watching. Europe is watching now. But watching isn't the same as controlling. And controlling is exactly what Europe no longer does. $500 billion annually. 4 million barrels daily. 94% capacity utilization. The numbers describe a fait accompli. The sovereignty corridor is operational. Europe's energy independence is over. Turkey's moment has arrived. And 42 gallons of crude oil, that simple barrel of hydrocarbons, now routes through channels that answer to Ankara. The map has been redrawn. The question is whether Europe understands the map it's now reading. 90 days to measurable impact. The countdown started 3 days ago. The first cargoes are already sailing.